Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today, we have a great panel discussion with two engineers who have actually deployed SPIRE in production and are trying to scale it within their organization as well. The purpose of this discussion is just to talk to real users who have experience from deploying SPIRE in production, some of the lessons learned, why they did it in the first place, what would they recommend to a newbie, and any other question that you have. Even these questions were taken from a series of conversations with SPIFFE community members, most of them who are at an early stage of deployment, some of them at a late stage of deployment, and naturally want to make it as interactive as possible too. Just keep your lines on mute. If you have any questions, just put in the chat window. And if you need more context, we'll ask you to unmute. And definitely in the end, we can spend a lot more time with your Q&A too. With that, before I start, and we start talking about SPIFFE and SPIRE projects, I wanted to introduce both the panelists today. Eli, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Eli Nesterov. I am working at ByteDance, the company behind TkTok in security team. So building lots of zero trust architecture based on SPIFFE and SPIRE and platforms that we call a zero trust identity.
Great. Matt, you want to do a quick intro?
Sure. So I'm Matthew McPherrin. I'm an engineer at Square. I work on our security infrastructure team. Our team is tasked with providing the secure primitives to the rest of the company to build a platform to securely run Square's business. Primarily for me, that means providing communication security for our internal microservice architecture.
Okay, great. So SPIFFE and SPIRE projects provide a standard and a tooling to standardize service identity and authentication across a variety of platforms, right? And because they are based on cryptographic identities, they reduce the reliance on hard-coded credentials or secrets of any sorts, and also network-based controls as well. So Matt, first of all, a lot of people ask us, what are the typical drivers that encourage users to start thinking about SPIFFE and SPIRE and eventually deploy it, right? So what were some of the drivers at Square that you guys started to deploy SPIRE?
Sure. So Square has had mutual TLS internally for a long time, many years, since early in the company when we decided to build a microservice architecture. And that's a great way to ensure you have a secure transport between applications. But one slightly unfortunate thing is that while we can take advantage of many of the patterns from the web PKI, it's not entirely sufficient. In particular, how you identify a client certificate hasn't necessarily been standardized before. And Square's a big fan of open source, and we found that sometimes it's difficult to interoperate with other systems that use mutual TLS because of this lack of standardization. SPIFFE URIs are a great way of thinking about service identity, and it really maps well to how we think about our infrastructure. Kind of another difference that we've run into from the web PKI is that we really wanted constrained certificate authorities. We run multiple environments, whether those are production and staging split apart, or even different business units or acquisitions inside the company. And we'd like to empower those different parts of the company to run their own PKI and to federate them together. But we'd also like to minimize kind of the blast radius of any of those PKIs having any sort of failure, whether security or operationally. And SPIFFE has the trust domain model, which we think works really well and was something that we didn't have as polished before. So when we were growing as a company, we realized that our existing infrastructure wasn't scaling. It was a single point of failure. And we needed to do a lot of work to integrate with new technologies that we wanted to adopt. In particular, Kubernetes is something that we really want to roll out. And we're also rolling out a lot of Envoy. So SPIRE was really attractive because it could issue SPIFFE certificates, which had a model that we liked for identity in Kubernetes, and they could work with Envoy. As well, certain parts of Square are adopting Istio, and Istio uses SPIFFE, so that's something that we're optimistic in the future we can get some interoperability there. So whether one team is using Istio and another team is using a different platform, the identities are common, so we can kind of have a shared service identity and an interoperable credential format between them.
Great. So Ila, how can you relate to it? I'm sure you guys have a lot of platforms too, and you operate across geographic boundaries too, right? Across across different countries, across different trust domains. What were some of your core drivers?
I think there have been multiple drivers. The primary was we started seeing like a big patterns of like different parts of our systems using different types of authentication. I think that was like a primary driver. So we started thinking about like how we can first of all build a good access platform on top of it or rebuild it. But it's been much harder and harder without having kind of what would be like centralized or like what will be unified identity we can use. So we started thinking about it, and like this is how we got to X509 and then SPIFFE and SPIRE eventually. But the bigger idea behind this is how we can have a unified identity across everything in our network, basically. So the primary driver was to first start with service-to-service communication. So I think it is a story similar to Square and what Matt was talking about. We have a bunch of Kubernetes clusters, and when we talk about cloud native, things are actually much better there. So we had an MTLS enabled in there. We used an Envoy console and things like this. So, but we have a huge data stack and bunch of legacy applications that's just basically running on individual nodes, and all of this like interconnected. So though in one part of this is very good, another part we still need to connect with legacy applications. And the process before there was kind of cumbersome, as not very automated in a good way, because we started building it like years ago. So there's still lots of kind of manual processes or like certificates that's used for MTLS that's been with a long TTL, like a year. And the pressure to DevSecOps team is much more over time. So we basically looked into, we started with requirements actually, like what the next system or like next generation system should look like for this, and how we can do not basically remove everything and start from scratch, but how we can evolve these systems and how we can merge them at some point of time in the future. And yeah, SPIFFE and SPIRE worked very good for this. I think we looked into Istio as well, but I think because of a bunch of requirements from other teams to legacy application, it didn't work. And it actually comes with, it's nice product, but it comes with a bunch of control plane and its own control plane and lots of things we didn't need. So that was like major driver for us to look into SPIRE itself. And another reason, I think we used JOT token for multiple things in a data stack as well, and for machine learning. So for those parts, having a system that can basically have a unified identity in a format X509 and a JOT was another major factor.
Okay, great. So Matt, coming back to you, you mentioned a couple of projects, Istio and Kubernetes and a bunch of others. A question that frequently the community members or people who are new to SPIFFE and SPIRE ask is, how do you use SPIFFE and SPIRE in the context of other CNCF projects or other open source projects or other software, right? How would you describe that?
Sure. So the primary way that we're using SPIRE today is for issuing certificates to envoys running both on Kubernetes as well as in our data centers on our previous homebrew deploy system. Those envoys use those TLS certificates to form a service mesh that's mutually authenticated, so both client and server-side certs. And this is the core internal communication platform at Square. We've developed a lot of in-house software that understands SPIFFE certificates too. Our workloads that sit behind those envoys still need to understand the SPIFFE URIs for authorization decisions, even if they're not talking directly to SPIRE. That mostly takes the form of libraries that are commonly used in the different programming languages that authors use to write services at Square. We also have Ghost Tunnel, which is a TLS proxy that we wrote, and we use that in some places where Envoy doesn't work for us. Ghost Tunnel now has built-in support for talking to the SPIFFE workload API and for using SPIFFE certificates for TLS. I actually think Ghost Tunnel was the first application to get SPIFFE support. Finally,
no, I definitely remember Ghost Tunnel from the early days.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
And finally, we're also using JOT SVIDs with Amazon's security token service, Assume Role with Web Identity. This will allow us to authenticate to Amazon services from our data center services without needing additional infrastructure. We're already issuing those identities in Spire, so we can leverage that infrastructure that we already have for our internal app mesh to also talk to any other external application that supports OIDC Connect, which includes Amazon's SDS Assume Role with Web Identity. So we're really excited about that because it's kind of, starting to pay off that we had just one initial use case, and now we're, seeing payback by supporting these kind of standards that we're now being able to interop with more things, even where we didn't even initially anticipate that being a use case.
Okay, great. I know you're one of the maintainers for the Spire projects as well, and one of the things that maintainers have been doing is trying to integrate SPIFFE and Spire with more and more technologies, and better embed them across the cloud native ecosystem. Eli, are there any platforms or languages or software tools that you're integrating Spire with?
Yeah, definitely. I think Envoy would be probably one of the things we are integrating with. So we use it as our sidecar proxy for services or for things that we are running and they come with, or like, let's say from open source, they don't have like a native support for SPIFFE and SPIRE. So instead of just rebuilding them and ending integration, so we use Envoy as a sidecar there. So they got an identity natively from SPIFFE and SPIRE, and all this running on Kubernetes. Another thing is we have a bunch of like backend platforms, and like our language stack is just basically primarily Go, Python, Java, C++. So we have an SDK for these languages, and there are different versions for like working with a SPIFFE specific to our system. So they just like super easy way to for developers to use it to get an access to BAM-TLS and a SPIFFE identity. And we use all this stuff to build like internal systems, like we rebuild our KMS to use a SPIFFE as a primary factor for how we do authorization internally. So we have like internal standard, how we use a SPIFFE identity, what information in there. So it allows us to write like a flexible policies, for example, similar to, there are lots of similarities we took from like content security policy, things like this, where you can use like, I don't know, stars to say, I wanna all this be available over all regions or things like this. So I think it's a good thing for people who are looking into what could be a next step with SPIFFE ID itself, because it has lots of flexibility in it. But from other product perspective, like looking into not cloud native stack or like legacy applications, so things like MySQL or etcd, these two primary products which we are starting with an integration, and we also are adding working with the console team now to add MTLS they're using SPIFFE identity, plus there are a bunch of internal system that's basically, it's kind of internal written configuration management system, which we also integrate in.
So I guess for people who are just getting started with SPIFFE and SPIRE projects, right? What would you guys recommend how they start, right? I know in an ideal world, you want to have MTLS everywhere, but what would be the day 1, day 2 steps that people will take to get started on the SPIFFE and SPIRE project and start, deploying it within their organizations as well?
I think there are a couple of aspects, and like basically 2 different big directions, right? One is a technical, another one more like on a partnership side and understanding your organization needs. So on a technical side, I think what is important to understand like internals and how SPIRE works, and I think there are lots of great examples and documentation on a spiffe.io website, and having basically bootstrap infrastructure, something that you can easily run on Kubernetes and play with the different examples. So that is the one thing that allow you to easily start and see what it is. That's one thing, but a second, you can show your partners basically and other teams how easy to use it and integrate. But that's like from educational perspective and understand like internals, because you'll need to connect this with your internal systems. Like how would you do like registration entries, for example, how this look with your control plane, and it could be specific from system to system. In my team, lots of engineers actually found very useful to first play with the setup, like bootstrap setup that is on a SPIFFE to understand, and then because many people new to Kubernetes world itself, and there is like another layer of SPIFFE and SPIRE on top of it, so they actually found very useful to rebuild this from scratch. Like don't look into examples, but how would they build everything and deploy on Kubernetes? So that is actually lots of help to understand all internals and avoid different mistakes that you can do in production. And for organization kind of level front, I think it's very important at the same time, while you kind of dive into technical details, to understand what other partners team, what problems you can easily solve with their with the systems that you have. And they're like, remember that in SPIRE there are lots of automation, right? And I'm pretty sure lots of this PKI, whether like managed internally, and there is lots of manual process around it that's easily solved by SPIFFE and SPIRE. So these, I think, are 2 primary factors. So
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and another thing I wanted to mention. So it's like, I think if we do it right now from a scratch, I would better spend more time on kind of this organizational side to understand all the different things that we need to do. Like how would we do, let's say, monitoring, what systems are internally and what's supported by SPIRE, can we use it, or we need to build something else, same as like logging, for example. Yeah, that would definitely solve and save lots of time in the future.
So Matt, what would you recommend? Maybe 1 or 2 things before we go into the lessons learned?
Yeah, I'd say one big thing with getting started is, make sure you have a test environment and like you can just try SPIRE out, without worrying about breaking your production system. Because I think in some ways, like the controls you would want on a production, cluster of SPIRE that's going to have sensitive key material and stuff is not necessarily conducive to having an interactive environment to just try Spire out, launch some different workloads, and see how it happens. So that's one thing, is I think it's definitely worth having some sort of hands-on sandbox, probably starting with one of the examples, and maybe deploying it on a cloud instance that you can spin up just for that test. The other big thing I'd say for getting started is definitely feel free to reach out to the community. The Spire Slack is pretty active, and if you want advice or feedback, I think there's a lot of people in the community who are happy to review any ideas you have or deployment plans, and discuss kind of how realistic they are, or like where you might be missing something, or maybe different alternatives. Because ultimately there are a lot of options in Spire, so making that set of decisions early on can be a little bit tricky. So that's definitely somewhere where you should absolutely feel free to leverage the community to help make decisions.
Great.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, we run Spire on our own, like security team managed Kubernetes clusters, and then we use lots of projects from CNCF. So basically it is much easier to get any answers on issues that you're facing on SPIFFE and SPIRE than on many other projects, to be honest.
Absolutely. So I do want to tell the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to send them to me, or put them in the chat window. Before everyone is putting their questions in, Matt, do you want to talk about some of the lessons learned that you can share from folks as you deployed Spire at Square?
Yeah, definitely. So the Spire rollout for us took a long time, as we still are one of the earliest adopters of Spire. And part of that was understanding what the possible kind of failure modes are, and then going through those, testing them, and making sure we had a plan to either fix them when they occurred, or also contributing fixes back upstream. And we actually contributed a bunch of code and features to make Spire work for our needs. And I kind of mentioned this a little bit previously, but Spire is a pretty complicated, but because it's a very flexible piece of software. So you definitely need to have kind of some understanding of how to use it and like what those different choices are. As it matures, it'll probably be easier as kind of there's more examples and more paths. But I would expect that for the few next big adopters, they'll need to contribute to get it working kind of similar to how we did. Really, the hardest part isn't actually running Spire. You kind of just like turn it on and it works. It mostly works well. It's really integrating with Spire that can be tricky, and that maybe I took a week to get Spire running, but then I spent the next couple of months making sure that all of our other systems were integrated with it. And that's also kind of harder knowledge to share because it's really specific to the choices that you make and the environment that you run in. And ultimately, that's kind of where we actually had to go back and change some of those things. I think some of the way we did things, like which attester plugins we use and stuff, we changed a little bit over time. And on the other hand, that's kind of also where the payoff is, where all we're doing is swapping plugins. We're not rewriting the software to take a new pattern, which is probably what we would have done if we had just kind of done this ourselves. So I think we kind of we had more decisions than we thought we were going to up front, and maybe things didn't always exactly work as we expected them to, just because we were so early and there weren't many examples to follow yet. But I think that is something that we can provide a more polished road now. It's been a couple of years actually since we started trying Spire out. I think we initially started looking at it in 2018. So it's been kind of 2 years of testing, and really in the last year we started actually using it in our production environment.
So before I move to Eli, I just had a quick question from Yuri. Matt, could you please talk a bit more about how you're working with JOT signed by external authorities?
We aren't using Spire with JOTs signed by external authorities. So at least in our case, the place The only place that we're using JOTs with SPIRE right now is where we have the, SPIRE has JOT SPIDs that it can issue, and we're using those to make outbound connections to AWS. So AWS has an endpoint on their security token service called assume role with web identity. And what that does is you present a JOT to it, and then you have to have previously configured Amazon with an identity provider. That identity provider is basically you give it a URL where it will fetch the keys that sign your JOT SPIDs. And in fact, in the SPIRE repo, there's a tool called, I think, the SPIFFE OIDC connector or something like that. And what it does is it takes the SPIFFE workload API and presents the JOT keys that it gets from the workload API as the standard OIDC Connect discovery API. So Amazon knows how to integrate with that to fetch your public keys for signing. And then all of our workloads at Square, we actually have a credential provider that the Amazon SDK can use, which we'll be open sourcing shortly once it's ready, that you can use to connect to Amazon. There's some stuff publicly right now you can't use it, but I think we're going to be improving that shortly with the work that we're doing right now.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Madhu, for sharing the link to that as well. So folks, feel free to keep typing questions. I do want to ask Eli really quickly, like, what about some of the lessons learned from your experience with SPIRE? If you can just take a couple of minutes and add anything that Matt might have missed.
Sure. Yeah. So to Matt's point, SPIRE itself is pretty stable, and the biggest thing you need to very well think through is for integration point. There's like huge plugin ecosystem and bunch of attestations that's already in there. So it depends on your environment what you're gonna use for attestation, right? So we initially been thinking about using X509 pub plugin for attestation, but then we realized that we basically need to build another systems that will distribute everything. So though our long-term plans is to use hardware-based attestation, we can start with it, and then we realize that we have a Kerberos already on all the systems, so we wrote our own Kerberos attester plugin that's been I think inspired a lot, but what's already in there. I think that was from one of early adopters, probably Bloomberg. But we have to change multiple things to our own specific. So that's one thing. Another thing on integration is the important point of building systems on SPIRE is for so login, for example, you might have a different requirements, because when you have a bunch of agents deployed everywhere, logs on agents, and it's basically your evidence of what's going on and why some workloads received this identity during attestation. So you might need to think about using a different systems for these logs, because you might need to store them longer, or you want to assign it to or attach it to other systems that's used for anomaly detection, for example. So that will save you kind of lots of time in future. And I think understanding your performance characteristics of your environment, there are lots of things that you can tweak in communication between SPIRE server agent and a data store. So having some sandbox test environment which you can easily do and play with these characteristics is also kind of important things to have.
Great, thank you. I know one more question came in, and maybe because Eli, I have you can quickly start with this. What about some of the design and implementation decisions you made? And if you went in a certain direction, why did you go in the other direction?
Yeah, there have been like one thing that I already mentioned about like how would we do attestation, and our story probably much more complicated than if you run on like specific cloud provider. We use all cloud providers, so we couldn't use like, we looked into possibility to use per cloud specific environments, but it just overcomplicates all the deployments we have. So that's one thing. Another, for design decisions, is like where you will run it. You have like Spire servers, right? And it's also specifically to case by case, and we didn't know how much we'll need to scale it. So instead of building tooling around how we gonna scale everything we need for Spire to run, we decided to make it more complicated and run on top of Kubernetes and build everything around it. So this is actually a good payoffs in the end, because we could easily iterate on multiple things without wasting time on building tooling around if you run it like with an environmental or things like this.
Great. Matt, would you add anything to that? What were some of the decisions you guys made? And why did you go one way versus the other?
Yeah, sure. So I think, I'd say one thing is there's a couple big decisions that you have to make upfront that can be harder to change later. And the biggest one of those really is how many, Spire clusters do you run, and kind of what are your trust domains set up? I think, that's something where we erred on the side of having more of them rather than less of them, because it's hopefully easier to combine them in the future than it is to have to try to split them out. If turns out you didn't make quite the right decision. So we went for separations kind of both by environment. So we have development environments, we have a staging environment, which is like a clone of our production environment that we deployed at first. And then we have the actual production environment. And then kind of vertically, we also have different business units who are running their own clusters or are running other software like Istio that might interop. So we kind of have this like matrix of trust domains. And I think that's, those decisions are something you have to think about early. It's tempting to just kind of start setting Spire up, but when you want to start using it, you really have to kind of think through some of these things. So I think that's one of the kind of most important thing, and maybe something that I kind of mentioned earlier talking to the community, that I think there's lots of advice you can get if you're not sure how to go on with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on the same topic, a lot of the community members are in the middle of now, beyond that testing phase and trying to operationalize Spire, right? I know you did a community day session on the topic too, but what would your tips for folks trying to operationalizing Spire, right? What would they need to do?
Yeah, sure. So I'd say one of the key things to keep in mind is that Spire is really likely to be a foundational piece of your platform when it's deployed and integrated. So you really need to make sure that you understand the operational trade-offs that you're making, which is similar to any other piece of software. But there's lots of knobs and options around Spire, so you kind of have to think through what those mean. At an absolute minimum, you need to have some kind of alerting and logging. For us, we focused on that early, and it really did pay off because we kind of saw where the trade-offs might be failing. One of the big things for us was certificate lifetime. We had to decide how long to do it, and that's kind of a tricky decision, bounded, I'd say, on the lower end by operational concerns. I mean, we can't have certificates that expire every second just because it'd be too much load. We can't have certificates that expire every 15 minutes because if something went wrong, we wouldn't have time to respond. But on the kind of the upper end, we can't have certificates that last a month because we need to be able to respond from a security point of view when something goes wrong. So we kind of narrowed those both from both ends, and we kind of ended up picking, depending on the exact situation, between a couple hours and a couple days for lifetime is, we thought made some reasonable trade-offs against the security and operational side of SPIRE. And I guess another thing to keep in mind also is that, SPIRE is going to be security sensitive. So making sure that you have the adequate controls around SPIRE. For us, that meant really thinking about the database, because registration entries are stored in SPIRE's database. You need to make sure that you have adequate controls around that to be secure. I think with the risks of things like insider attacks or malware on an engineer laptop or kind of stuff, you want to make sure that your engineers don't have access to just go and poke entries into the database, because that could potentially be a very powerful tool to an attacker. As well, there's you have to think about the provisioning flows. That workload that's coming online and getting its identity. How does it get that? What controls are on that? Because if anybody can just deploy a workload that can have any identity, you're going to be in a bad situation. So I think those kind of security considerations around how you deploy it, as well as the operational considerations that I think Eli mentioned a little bit earlier around making sure you have logging and monitoring and metrics and that kind of stuff can pay off.
Yeah. I guess Eli, any one or two things you want to quickly add to this? Then I have a couple other questions from the
I think it's similar to lots of things that Matt mentioned. So basically, building your architecture and design earlier and understand all the pieces and dependency, it will be low-level dependency for rest of your infrastructure. So you need to think through all the possible scenarios. That's one thing. So having like really good design, and the second, understand the low-level dependency for this platform itself, because you rely on like how your data center communicate with each other, what's like your backbone network, what's the disaster recovery scenarios for this, and what's your requirements as well for all the systems. And a second is because it is basically could be the only public infrastructure eventually in your system, you need to think through the threat model for everything related to operating it. And of course, like bunch of things that's on top of this that would allow you to understand from different points of view whether your infrastructure is functional properly, so basically what's kind of monitoring you have, and where you can find answers when you see some metrics goes off from normal perspectives.
Great, thank you. I know I've been getting some private questions too, but if you want to post your question to everyone so everyone else can see it too, but I'll definitely ask. I guess another question is, how do I convince my management? How did you guys convince your management when you started deploying SPIRE, right? Because I think a lot of people, honestly, I have heard too that they're engineers, they like the concept, they want to implement it, but naturally, even though it's an open source project, you need resources, you need time to have it deployed, right? Matt, you want to take that first?
I'm not a great person to ask this, because in my case, actually upper management, I think, was enthusiastic about this before the engineers were. I think a number of Square's early engineering InfoSec leadership were kind of involved in some of the early discussions with the SPIFFE project and getting that set up. So I think, but realistically, for us, from an engineering standpoint, we presented it to the rest of an organization as kind of, this is how we're supporting Square's expansion. So, Kubernetes obviously is a big thing in the wider community, but, it was especially interesting for us as we wanted to, turn down some of our homegrown systems in favor of, these much more flexible deploy systems based on, containers and having better auto scaling and a bunch of other features that we get from Kubernetes. So kind of out of the box, kind of ask, how are we going to keep our existing infrastructure alive on Kubernetes? Kind of the answer is, well, we're not going to keep our existing infrastructure. We're going to switch to Spire. It could be open source. And like, I think across our engineering organizations, a lot of the engineers kind of already knew some of the pain points. You know, we had our own MTLS that like required people to have, you know, libraries. And, you know, I don't want to put shame on myself, but like I wasn't always the best at writing documentation about how things were supposed to work. So having that community, you know, being able to search on Google or Stack Overflow or have a public Slack with different people can really make, you know, these more standardized service communication, authorization, and authentication mechanisms be more easily understood by, you know, engineers across a large, diverse organization. I mean, at this point, there's thousands of employees at my company. I can't know them all. I can't like individually teach everyone how TLS works. But I can say, you know, okay, here's the standard API. You know, a bunch of people have worked on it. We've thought about it. It's not just kind of what I came up with in 20 minutes while reviewing a pull request. You know, it's got a bit of polish to it. So I think, you know, that's kind of the general story is that, you know, it interops with the stuff we want it to without having to do everything ourselves. I think, you know, maybe a harder choice is how do you choose SPIFFE and SPIRE versus SPIFFE and Istio? And that's something that, you know, you really have to look at, like, does Istio meet your needs? And in our case, it didn't meet them in all situations because we had legacy infrastructure, because we had existing systems, we had an existing traffic control plane, and there was a lot of flexibility in Spire to integrate across all of those different environments in a way that other options didn't.
Great. I guess two key takeaways from me is at least tied to a overall business driver, like you did adoption of Kubernetes, right? And also clearly articulate why the other approaches are not or have limitations in it. I'm going to just do a last call for any last questions. At the moment, please type in those questions. In the meantime, Eli, any recommendations you would give if someone is trying to build a business case for SPIFFE and SPIRE within the org, talking to their management?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's part of the things that's been already started in our organization, but the biggest drivers was basically how we can build or rebuild what we already have. So we have a bunch of applications running on cloud native stacks using MTLS, but their legacy apps stack is also huge, and supporting them and adding MTLS in there was one of the major factors. So just basically to understand what is the pain points in the organization, which you can easily get from SPIFFE and SPIRE. And it could be different drivers depends on what's your situation. But I think the two primary things you'll get using SPIRE is automation for both sides, right? For cloud native and legacy. And if you're not building everything, if you're building everything new, it's probably much easier to do with the cloud native stacks nowadays. But if your organization that's been on a market for like more than 5 years, I'm pretty sure it's a like huge legacy stack. And this is where your like SPIRE works much better than things like Istio, for example. And yeah, so these are two things, and just basically understand your security organization, like what is your security organization goals, where you want to be like in 3-5 years with that, and how what you have right now will look like.
Great. Thank you so much, guys. I don't think we have any more questions. I did want to limit it to about 45 minutes. I know, thank you everyone for joining us live and spending 45 minutes with us. I don't think anyone dropped, so that's good. This will be recorded and this will be posted on the SPIFFE Slack community channel as well. Thank you so much, Eli. Thank you so much, Matt. I'm sure a lot of these attendees found this information valuable as well. Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Guys. Thank you, Umair, for having us.
Yeah, thank you.